Hey, economics students, I hope you're having a nice week, and I hope you're ready for the second lesson of our week this week about personal financial management. Um, Particularly, we're going to be getting into how to save and the different ways you can invest your money. We've talked about income, we've talked about expenses, and really that's the ball game when it comes to personal financial fitness and literacy. Know your income and budget for your expenses and make sure that you don't spend more than your income. And I know that sounds super easy. It's not always that easy. The important thing is create a budget. Always analyze your budget. Make sure your projected incomes are meeting your projected expenses. And if they're not, you need to adjust accordingly. Um, but we are going to go a little bit beyond that today by talking about what savings looks like and what you can invest in if you ever want to invest. We're not going to go into like a ton of financial analysis and stuff, but I'll give you a general overview of the common types of investments that people can make. So I do want to just review this sort of the assignment for this week, and I created one of these budgets for each student in economics. So each one of you, I would like for you to do your best with this, and it might look a little bit confusing or difficult, but it really isn't. I'm not asking you to do anything that's too difficult here. I already kind of did the hard work putting this together. And again, this is based on the Elizabeth Warren 50, 30, 20 budget. And hopefully by now, you've done the 50-30 aspect. 50% of your income should go towards your needs, the things you need in order to survive or not get thrown in jail. In other words, you don't want to be delinquent on your debts. And then 30% of your income should go to your wants. Today, we're going to talk more about then this last 20%. All you need to do, and I don't know if I explained this really well, you just need to fill in the highlighted cells. And you don't even have to fill every single cell in. That would be, ridiculous. There's a lot of them. But try to, again, estimate your yearly income using the income lesson from last week. And so just for the sake of argument, we'll say that you want to be, um, I'm trying to think of something that would pay $50,000 a year. Whatever. We'll just say you want to be Mr. Court's sidekick. I pay very well, 50,000 a year to be a sidekick for me. So once you put the income in this top field, everything else auto-populates. So it's going to figure out your yearly income after tax, because all of this down here you should budget for what your post-tax income is. Now I kind of lowballed this. You're going to pay more in taxes than that probably, but regardless. And then down here, it already takes your monthly income and divides it accordingly. So half of your monthly income, if you make $50,000 a year, half of your monthly income is $1,875, 30% of your monthly income is $1,125, and 20% of your monthly income is $750. All right, and so what I'm asking you to do then is figure out your budget, that if you had to live on this amount, 1875, to meet your basic needs, how would you allocate those dollars? And I already gave you the averages. This is the average mortgage, the average groceries, the average car payment, the average car insurance. All right. And these are all the things you usually have to pay when you're living on your own. And there's usually more than this. All right. But again, what ends up happening once you enter what your estimates are going to be. So if you say, okay, I'll pay $550 a month in rent. All right. This cell here is going to keep a running tally of how much you are paying. And then this cell is just subtracting your actual amount, your budgeted amount from the amount that you're estimating that you will pay. And your responsibility, your task is to budget an amount that doesn't go over 1875. And if you end up just trying to, use these average amounts, you'll find out that very quickly you are going to go over budget. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just put in the average amounts here. And all of a sudden our green went to red. So if you just pay the average amount for all of these things without even looking at any of the utilities or your cell phone, you have already gone over budget. So you have to go back up and then figure out, where are you going to cut? So maybe you're going to find a cheaper apartment. Maybe, you're going to work your way through college. Now all of a sudden you're back in the green and you can, keep paying your monthly bills from there. All right. The only thing is I ask you to do is to, if you end up with an estimate lower than an average, just explain, how you're going to spend less money than average. So again, right here it says student loan payment. I said I'm going to pay $150 a month instead of $350 a month, and I would just type in that I'm going to go to a community, or I'm going to go to a 2-year college, or I'm going to work my way through college so my loans won't be so high. So that's how I'm going to keep my student loan payments down. All right, so that's what I'm asking you to do. Then you'll do the same thing over here for your wants. You don't have to go quite into the same level of detail. And today we're going to talk about savings and investments. All right, so let's go ahead and transition into our final unit today, savings and investments. So in particular, when we first started this unit, instead of calling this savings and investments, we said that one of the parts of being financially literate was building our assets. An asset is anything that one owns which has value. All right, an asset can include a house. An asset can be a savings account. An asset can be a stock or a bond. An asset can be a car. An asset can be a retirement account like a 401k or an IRA. These are all examples of assets. Today, we're going to primarily say, instead of using the term assets, I'm going to be talking about saving and investing. Savings accounts and investments are examples of assets. In any budget, you should always put some amount of money into assets. Particularly, you want to save money and invest money whenever you possibly can, and I'll explain why here in a second. So some basic rules of savings and investing. When you are investing, what you're doing is you are typically allowing people to borrow money from you. Either you're allowing a bank to borrow money from you, you might be allowing a corporation to borrow money from you, you might be allowing somebody not necessarily to borrow money, but if you're a landlord, you're allowing people to borrow land from you, and they agree to then pay you back. And the examples of people borrowing money, they will pay you back with interest. So not only will they pay you back the amount they borrowed, but they'll pay you back an additional amount we call interest. And in this world, to be financially literate, you want interest to work for you. You want people to be paying you interest after they borrow money from you. Unfortunately, most of us fall into the trap where we are the ones who borrow too much money and we are working to pay back interest. All right. Ideally, you want interest to work for you. You don't want to literally have to work just to pay people interest. One thing to keep in mind, if you do absolutely nothing with your money, if you get a paycheck, you take that paycheck and you get a bunch of cash and you take that cash and you quote unquote store it in a mattress because whatever you don't want to spend it, you just decide to, store it in a mattress for a later date. Essentially, over time, the value of that money is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. If you don't save or invest money, the value of your dollar decreases. And that's because every year, nearly every year, I should say, there is what we call inflation. Inflation is when the value of your dollar decreases because prices are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why it's called inflation. Prices are inflating, just like a balloon inflates. All right, in general, you can estimate yearly inflation to be about 2 to 3%. So what costs a dollar today, a year from now might cost $1.03. 2 years from now, it would cost like $1.06 or $1.07. All right, and over time, as things get more expensive, if all you're doing is keeping your money sort of stashed away, you're not going to be able to buy as much with it in the future because prices are getting more and more expensive. So you want to take money and invest it wisely and save it wisely. So moving on, before you make any sort of a significant investment in savings or a significant investment in assets like buying a house or investing in the stock market, there's a couple things you want to do first. And this, as a former school counselor, the story that comes to mind is the story of like whenever I would sit down across from or across from a student and ask them sort of what their goals were after they graduate. And I always thought this was sort of people made these stories up when I went through school counseling school, but it's true. There would always be at least one student a year who'd say, "Oh, I'm going to be a professional football player or a professional basketball player." Very serious, like exceptionally serious. That was their goal, and I'm not dismissing that. Some people can do that, and that's great. That's a great goal to have. And I said, "Oh, okay. So you must be on the football team. So how's that going?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, I was the backup JV long snapper this year, so yeah, it was pretty good." And I'm thinking, "Oh goodness, okay, you're probably not going to make it in the NFL." Now, I wouldn't necessarily just come out and be brutally honest with that, but it was always interesting that some of these people, some of the students would have these really grandiose ideas of what they could do, but they didn't have the foundation set in order to get there. And the same is true with investments. A lot of times there are students who want to know the magic bullet, like, all right, I want to and I want to find the right stocks to invest in. I'll invest in those stocks. I'll make it big. I'll strike it rich without having to work really hard, and then I'll be financially literate. It doesn't work like that. That's like saying I'm going to go straight to the NFL after being the backup JV long snapper my junior year of high school. All right. Before you want to start really investing hard in stocks and doing all that, first, you want to make sure that you have a basic savings account set up with 6 months of income. So on average, if you're making about $50,000 a year, you want a savings account with about $25,000 in it, because you never know when there's going to be some sort of an emergency situation. Like, for example, there might be some global pandemic someday where people aren't allowed to go to work, like that would ever happen, right? And if that occurs, you need to have some money saved up so that for at least a few months, you'll be able to pay your bills, feed your family, and then find a way to land on your feet and find another opportunity. All right. Now, once you have 6 months of savings sort of in a savings account, it doesn't really do you any good to add more than that, because a typical savings account only gets you about 1% interest return if you're lucky. Like my savings account, I don't even think has hit a full percent ever since I've had it. And if you remember, inflation every year is about 2 to 3%. So every dollar that you have in a savings account, even though it's better than storing it in a mattress, it's still a dollar that's losing its value that you could better invest it somewhere else to gain more value. So generally speaking, before you start making significant investments in a lot of stocks and things like that, you want to build up a very basic savings account with enough money so if there's an emergency situation, you have 6 months of income. And then once you do that, it doesn't really help you to put much more than that into a traditional savings account. And the nice thing, the reason you want it just in a traditional savings account is that, or at least a money market account, we'll go into that in a second, is that it's very easy to draw money out of a savings account. All right. If you had a lot of your money drawn, like if you spend all of your money to buy a new house and all of a sudden a pandemic hits and you need to get money back, you have to then sell your house. It's not a liquid asset. It's not easy to all of a sudden sell your house to get all your money back. All right, so you want a savings account is very simple. You can, if you need the money, you take it out of your ATM or you go to the bank and withdraw it from your account. There's no charges usually, there's no fees, and it's easy to get to. The other key thing about starting to invest, make sure before you start to spend a ton of money on investments, you want to make sure that if you have any significant bad debt, particularly credit card debt, pay that off first. So if you carry a large balance on a credit card bill, and we're going to talk more about credit cards next week, um, you want to pay that down first. Because if you don't pay your balance on a credit card bill, depending on, especially if you have late fees, but depending on your credit history, your credit ranking, sometimes the interest you have to pay if you owe a credit card company money is as high as 50 or 25%. And if you have any late fees on top of that, it's jack it up even higher. So it doesn't do you any good to invest a bunch of money and get even an amazing 10% return on that investment if you're just going to turn around and throw it all away anyway, paying late fees and paying interest rates on a large credit card bill. All right, so those are some of the big things to hit before you even worry about these next couple slides. The last thing we're going to hit before we talk about specific types of investments, it's important to remember that when you think of investing, time and interest are the two things that are on your side, especially now that you are very, very young. One rule to think of is the rule of 72, and this rule helps you figure out um, how much money you can make at a given interest rate. So if you take 72, the number 72, and you divide it into whatever the interest rate that you are getting on your investment, it will tell you in theory, this isn't an exact science here, but it will tell you how long it takes for your investment to double in value. So if you have an investment that you're getting a 1% return, interest rate return on, like a traditional savings account, you take 72 divided by 1, and that means it'll take you 72 years for that investment to double. If you have a 10% interest rate, if you're getting a 10% return on your investment, which is very high, if you take 72 and divide it by 10, that gets you the number of 7.2, which means that for every 7.2 years, your investment will double. And here's what that looks like. If you right now put $100 into an account, just some hypothetical account, and for the next 72 years, so between now and when you turn like 90 years old, you don't touch that account. You put no money in, you take no money out. All right. If you are getting a 1% return of interest on that investment, meaning that your investment doubles once every 72 years, essentially that $100 investment over 72 years would double once, and you would end up getting $200. All right. You would have earned $100 by putting a $100 deposit into an account with 1% interest over 72 years. If instead you were getting a 10% interest rate, so what that means is now every 7.2 years, your amount is doubling. And because we talked about compounding interest before, it's not just your initial investment that's doubling, it's what every dollar doubles on top of itself. All right. And so what that means is in 72 years, that $100 will double 10 times. So it'll go from $100 to $200 in the first 7.2 years, to $400 in the next 7.2 years, to $800 the next 7.2 years, to $1,600 in the next 7.2 years. And by the time after 72 years is up, you'll have over $100,000 without even throwing any extra money into it, because your amount keeps doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling because of compounding interest. So again, that's the idea, that time is on your side and interest is on your side. When you can start early and invest at an early age and let time and interest work for you, a very small investment, now this is a very dramatic example, but a very small investment can really grow rapidly over the course of your lifespan. So when we get into these common types of investments, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about each one, but these are all very common types of investments that most people have a general understanding of, and I want to make sure that you have at least some awareness of what each one of these things are. Traditional bank accounts are probably the most common form of investments that, especially for students of your age, that you have the most amount of experience with. The nice thing about bank accounts is that they're relatively safe because the federal government through the FDIC insures deposits up to $250,000, meaning that even if your bank goes bankrupt and does not and loses all of its money, the government guarantees that you will get your money back. The government will pay you whatever your deposit was, as long as it wasn't more than $250,000, which is a terrible, because I have like way more than that in my bank account. The nice thing also, that's a joke. The nice thing also is that it's liquid, meaning that it's easy to go and get your money out of a bank account. That's what liquidity means. It's easy to turn your asset into cash. Bonds are very familiar to a lot of students. A lot of you might get as gifts from parents and grandparents savings bonds in lieu of cash. And essentially what a bond is, it's when you allow someone to borrow money, typically a government, either like our federal government or a state government. Sometimes you allow a school district to borrow your money to build a school building. And when you allow people to borrow money, they agree to pay you back with interest. Typically, you get a little bit of a higher rate of return, meaning you get a higher interest rate on your investment than you do in a traditional bank account, but you do run a little bit of a risk that sometimes when you let particularly when you let corporations borrow money, you run a risk that they will default, meaning they will not be able to pay you back. So there is a little bit of a risk. You don't have your money necessarily guaranteed. Some bonds, though, are generally risk-free. Stocks. A lot of you probably have heard of the stock market. For whatever reason, we love the stock market in the United States of America. It's sort of one of the things we look at when we determine whether or not we have a strong economy, even though the stock market is not even close to representation of what our economy is. But regardless, it is a very big part of our economy. A stock is nothing more. When you buy stock, you are simply buying ownership in a corporation. All right, so if you buy stock, you become a part owner of a corporation. So if I go and buy stock in Apple and Apple, I am a part owner of the Apple company. And as a stockholder, that means every now and again I will get to vote on who I want to sit on the Apple board of directors. That board of directors then selects the CEO of Apple. And in general, that's how corporations work. Stock people who want to can buy stock and become part owners. And I mean, when we say part owners, I mean a tiny minuscule part owner of a corporation. It's generally higher risk and higher reward. When you buy stock, you always run the risk that the corporation you're buying stock in goes bankrupt and doesn't do well. So like if you had stock in Sears back in the 1980s, you probably had a pretty good stock, good performing stock. Nowadays, Sears is virtually bankrupt. That stock would have lost a lot of value in the past 10 years. Real estate. A lot of people will invest in real estate, and this could mean a lot of different things. Real estate is generally the idea of owning a physical piece of land or property. All right, so typically when you think of owning real estate, we literally mean that you will buy a house perhaps someday and be a homeowner. You own your own real estate. Some people, though, will buy like apartment buildings, or they will buy up other land and rent it to other people and make money that way. Usually, not always, I've unfortunately been on the bad end of this. Usually, property and land holds its value over time. So if you buy land today for like $100,000 for an acre of land somewhere, 10 years from now, when you sell it, you're probably going to make more than $10,000 or $100,000 on it. And you probably will make enough to cover the inflation over that period of time. And then finally, typically speaking, people should be, if they're not, and even you should be at this point, putting money away into retirement accounts. There are different types of retirement accounts, but a retirement account is a specific account which is set up to pay a certain amount of money once you reach a certain age, or not necessarily a certain amount of money, but it's set to pay up to start withdrawing from once you reach retirement age. And we'll go into some more details here in a second. So looking at traditional bank accounts, when you think of bank accounts, usually when we think of savings accounts, we have what are called the traditional passbook savings accounts. These are what most people have. These are just the traditional savings accounts. They're easy to set up at any bank. They're easy to access. You can get your money in, get your money out. Usually there aren't a lot of fees involved, if any. So, again, this is usually, generally speaking, a savings account is what most students understand when they think of saving money. The issue with savings accounts is you don't make a lot of money with a savings account. Some savings accounts will have interest where the bank will give you a little bit of an interest rate. In other words, pay you a little bit of money to open a savings account with that bank, but it's usually less than 1%. And like we talked about earlier, inflation is usually 2 to 3% a year. Again, the reason for having a savings account is that it's easy to access. Now, once you have a decent job, in place of a traditional savings account, a money market account is like a savings account, but you have to keep a larger balance in the bank. So you might need to, in order to have a money market account, which again, it's very similar to a savings account. Generally, the money that a bank uses or collects in a money market account, they use it and invest it differently than they do the money that's in a passbook savings account. The difference of the money market account as far as investors are concerned, generally speaking, you have to keep a certain balance. So like if you only have $1,000 or $2,000 in your savings account, I should say only, I mean, that's good. Whatever you have saved is good. All right. That might not be enough to have a money market account. Usually in a money market account, you need to have a certain minimum balance in your money market account, but you do get a higher interest rate than a traditional passbook account. And then finally, a lot of banks will offer what are called certificates of deposits. And what this is when a bank asks to borrow money. This is when a bank wants some cash on hand. And so if a bank gives you a CD, What that means is a certificate of deposit. That means that you are loaning the bank some money. You are giving them some of your cash. And in exchange, they are giving you a certificate that proves that you have deposited money in that bank, a certificate of deposit. And that certificate of deposit has certain requirements that you will get your money back with interest, but you usually have to wait a certain number of years. You get a higher interest rate, but again, it's not as liquid. You can't just go and get your money back out of a certificate of deposit. And if you do, usually you have to pay a very high fee, so you end up losing money on it. Generally speaking, a CD is something you have to wait 5 to 10 years to go back and get your cash and interest back on. So those are sort of the traditional ways to save money in a bank. So a bond is a little bit different. A bond is somewhat similar to a certificate of deposit. The details, though, are quite a bit different on the interest you get and how you get repaid on that interest. But essentially, a bond is issued when a financial institution needs to borrow money for a long period of time. And a bond can be issued from a bank. It can be issued by a corporation. Corporations can sell bonds. A lot of times governments will sell bonds. This is how the federal government um, manages its money. If it needs more money than it collects in taxes, it usually sells bonds. And again, that's what the government debt is. It's when the government sells a lot of bonds. It gets money from individuals. In exchange, it gives those individuals bonds, which is essentially a promise to pay that person back with interest. In general, there isn't a guarantee of repayment in a bond. However, if you buy a bond, you can sort of determine, there's a way to determine whether or not you can um, get your money back and take on less risk with certain bonds than others. So some banks and some governments have a very solid credit history, meaning that they don't default on their debts, and you can kind of trust that if you buy a bond from certain corporations or banks or governments that you'll get paid back. And generally, a bond has what's called a maturity rate of about 10 years, meaning that you have to hold on to a bond for 10 years in order to get the full interest and full principal back on it. So again, it's not as liquid. Once you buy a bond, you can't just turn around and turn it into cash very easily, unlike a savings account. If you're going to buy a bond, there are a lot of different companies that will rate bonds. So like, for example, if you're going to buy a bond from the United States federal government, you can look and see the rating of the United States federal government. So if somebody who is borrowing money has a good credit rating, and you can be pretty sure that they will pay you back, they will get a high rating, like a AAA rating. If you are going to buy a bond from a corporation that is a shady corporation that is not, run very well and is promising a very high rate of return, they might get a very low grade, like a D. And what that means is that yes, this corporation might be promising to pay you back with a lot of interest, but there's a really good chance that they aren't going to be able to do it. There's a really good chance they're going to default and you are out of the money that you are investing. Again, AAA is the best. Triple D to D is usually something that is really, really bad and in default. Anytime you buy a bond that is rated triple B or below is what we would consider a junk bond, meaning um, there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to get your money back. The reason that some people will buy junk bonds is that if you do get your money back, and if you do end up investing in a company that somehow strikes it rich against all odds, you get a higher rate of interest back. Most of the bonds that people are familiar with are government bonds. Again, the federal government, when it needs money, it will sell bonds. And you can buy a government bond from a $50 bond, and that's where you pay the government. Like you might pay the government $40. They give you a $50 savings bond, and they say in 10 years when you cash this bond in, you'll get $50 back. All right, so essentially you just made $10 worth of interest over the course of that time. And you can buy them in very large increments. And the federal government is a very, very low risk issuer of bonds. The federal government pays its debts. The United States federal government is a very safe investment in terms of bonds. That's why you don't get a huge interest rate out of those bonds, because you're not taking a large risk when you buy a federal government bond. Um, I'm not going to go into those details. There's a lot of different types of federal bonds and treasury bonds, um, and each one has different strengths and weaknesses. You can also buy bonds from foreign governments, like France will sell bonds, Great Britain will sell bonds, but again, you're taking a risk. Like, would you buy a bond from North Korea? I wouldn't, but then again, they would not be selling bonds on the open market for all sorts of reasons. Likewise, there are what are called municipal bonds. City and state governments will also sell bonds. School districts will sell bonds. A lot of times, school districts will fund their new construction through selling bonds. That's how sometimes school districts will go into debt to build, a building, and then they pay the bonds back in the course of 10 plus years. Now, stocks are a little bit different. When you sell a bond, when you're buying and selling bonds, you're just letting people borrow money, and then you're getting money back with interest, as long as the issuer of the bond doesn't default on its payment. A stock is when you actually buy ownership in a corporation. And if you own stock, there are two different ways that you can make money. First, if the corporation that you have stock in is really, really, really profitable. So if you own stock in Apple, and Apple has a very profitable quarter or a very profitable year, and they have tons of money, sometimes what they will do is they will take that money and they will give it to their stockholders, and that is called a dividend. When you get money from a corporation that you own stock in, and you can choose to either take that dividend in cash, or you can choose to just get more stock with your dividend. Likewise, another way you can make money through buying stock is through what is called capital gains, and this is very straightforward. All right, when you buy stock, there is a certain stock price you buy at. So if the stock price of Apple is $100 per share, and you have $100, that means you can buy one share of Apple stock. Now, in a year from now, if their stock price goes up to $200 a share, you can sell that share now for $200, and you just made a capital gain of $100. The capital, the money, in other words, that you invested has increased over time with that particular stock. So the stock market is typically a higher risk investment because your stock can lose value if there is economic deterioration. Like, for example, let's say about a year ago at this time, let's say that you got a $400 payment from McDonald's. You got a job at McDonald's, you got $400, and you decided you wanted to invest it in stocks. And you said, you know what? I'm going to invest it into an oil company because I feel like everybody always buys oil. I feel like that would be a really good investment. So about a year ago, it was $40 a share to buy a share of British Petroleum stock. So if you had $400, you could buy 10 shares of British Petroleum stock. So let's say you did that. So you bought 10 shares you spent $400, bought 10 shares of British Petroleum stock. All of a sudden, about a month ago, well, I guess it would have been about 2 months ago now, right when the coronavirus pandemic hit, the demand for oil and the supply of oil just completely crashed the market for oil. And a share of stock went from $40+ all the way down to now $16. So at this period of time, if you would have sold your 10 shares of stock, you paid $400 to get 10 shares of stock. If you sold them right when the pandemic was hitting, you would have only gotten $160 back. So you would have lost $240 worth of stock. So again, that's how stocks can be high risk, high reward. Sometimes you buy stock and you end up getting a ton of money because your corporations do well, they beat their earnings, and you can sell it. You can buy low and sell high. Sometimes you buy stock high and then the market tanks and you're sort of stuck with very little left. Now, in general, the stock market over time has seen about a 7% return on the investment, on an average investor's investment. So this shows the stock market, and this is what is called the Dow Jones, which is sort of, you take the 30 largest corporations and combine them together. This is their average. So like these are companies like Coca-Cola, Apple, Walmart, Dow Chemical. But if you look at the Dow Jones, this sort of is an indicator of stock prices. All the way back in like 1980, you can see what the Dow Jones average was, and you can see over time, even though there's peaks and valleys, over time, stocks have increased pretty well. However, even though on average stocks have increased by about 7%, over the course of a couple decades, if you happen to own the stock in the specific corporations that fail, that 7% average doesn't mean much because you just happen to pick the wrong corporations, unfortunately. That's why a lot of people, when they buy stocks, they diversify, meaning they don't buy stocks in one company only. They buy it from multiple corporations. So they might buy some stocks in low risk companies, like companies that we're pretty sure aren't going to go bankrupt, like Walmart or Coca-Cola. And then they might also buy some stocks in high-risk corporations. Like, for example, I have an idea for gourmet Rice Krispie treats, and I'm going to call it the Courthouse Crispery Company. A crispery is a fancy place that makes Rice Krispie treats. And if you want to buy stock in that corporation, I would be willing to take your money and start my Courthouse Crispery. But that's high risk because there's a really good chance that I'm not going to make a lot of money and that corporation is going to go bankrupt and you're not going to get any of that stock investment back. But who knows? Maybe, just maybe, my Courthouse Rice Krispie treats catch fire and it becomes the biggest in-demand product in the country. And now all of a sudden your stocks could go through the roof. So in order to diversify, and it takes a lot of time to look at every single stock to make sure you have, certain stocks in certain industries to make sure you're diversified so that you're experiencing long-term growth. So instead, what a lot of people do is they invest in what are called mutual funds and something that are similar but a little different, exchange traded funds. And what these are like, think of them as like baskets full of a lot of different stock companies. All right, so when you invest in a mutual fund, you are giving your money to a broker, somebody who specializes in buying and selling stock. He is taking money from other people, and together he's taking all of this money and he is investing it for you, or she is investing it for you in multiple different companies, multiple stocks, and sometimes bonds as well. And exchange traded funds are similar to mutual funds, only there aren't any bonds in an exchange traded fund. It's like you're buying a fund that has multiple different types of stock in it. So they kind of do the diversification for you so you don't have to put the time and effort into it. So that's how stocks work. Real estate, like we said, real estate is property that is made up of land. It can include buildings, animals, natural resources, anything that is on the land that is being owned. In real estate, it's usually divided into three types. There's residential property, meaning people's property, like if you own a house that is residential. Commercial property, which is like any sort of property that has a business on it. So like a mall or a strip mall or an auto body shop, that is considered commercial property. And then there's property that's considered industrial property, and that's any property that have farmland or factories. If you buy a house, technically you own real estate. As a homeowner, you own real estate. And the nice thing about owning real estate, owning a house, is that typically it holds its value compared to inflation. So if you buy a house today for $100,000, 10, 20 years from now, generally speaking, you'll be able to sell it for more than $100,000. And typically you can sell it for an amount that covers the inflation rate over that period of time. Not always. Again, I ended up having to sell a house when I moved from Dover to Ashland in 2008. I had to sell a house, I'm sorry, 2011. I had to sell a house for less than what I paid for it because unfortunately, there's always a risk involved in everything. The nice thing about owning real estate, not only is it sort of an asset, but it also covers your basic need for shelter and protection. So it's like 2 for 1. Some people, when we talk about real estate, will do more than simply buy their own house. Some people, if they have enough money, they will invest in commercial or industrial real estate to try to make a profit. In other words, they become landlords who allow other people to either live off of the land that they own or work on the land that they own and then pay them rent. And if you rent an apartment, you understand this well because you pay a landlord every month. That landlord owns the property that landlord owns the apartment or the house you're living in, and you are paying that person rent. So that's one way that you can invest in real estate, is you can become a landlord. Finally, if you like the idea of investing in real estate, investing in something that is actually tangible property as opposed to investing in stocks and bonds, which are more, financial tools, um, there are things that are called real estate investment trusts that are kind of like mutual funds for real estate, where you and a bunch of other people pool your money together, and then there is um, some sort of a financial institution that takes that money and invests it in all sorts of different types of real estate on your behalf. So it's kind of like being able to own real estate without having to actually be a landlord. Because being a landlord carries with it a lot of responsibilities. You have to maintain the lawn, maintain property. You have a lot of legal responsibilities that essentially, if you own a real estate investment trust, you can kind of get the benefits of owning land without some of the costs. Um, and then finally, the one thing about real estate is that the value of property is often tied to the economic and geographic realities of its individual surroundings. That's why the idea of location, location, location is so important when you're looking at buying a house, or if you're going to actually invest in land to rent to people. So like, for example, if I bought a big piece of land on the outskirts of Ashland that I thought was just absolutely beautiful property, and I built a beautiful apartment building there, an apartment complex, luxury living at Quartz Apartments on the outskirts of Ashland, Ohio, and I want people to pay me a lot of rent to live there. If all of a sudden, somebody comes in and buys the land right next to my apartment, and they use it for a pork slaughterhouse where there's going to be a lot of unpleasant noises and smells and sights and sounds, all of a sudden, no one's going to want to live in my apartments anymore. So the value of my real estate completely took a nosedive because of the economic and geographic realities of where I had built my apartments. So location, location, location has a big impact on real estate values. And then finally, retirement. It is really important that you start to save for retirement as soon as possible. And again, this goes back to one of the earlier slides. Time and interest are on your side now that you guys are young. All right. The longer you can save, the longer you can have money invested at as much of an interest rate as possible, the more you will have when you reach the age of retirement. In general, the two most common ways to save for retirement. First, there is something called a 401k. A 401k is an employer-provided retirement plan. So a lot of employers, when you get hired in the private sector, will say that they have a 401k plan, or that they will help you with a 401k plan. What that means is that when you get your paycheck, your employer will take a portion of the paycheck, we'll say like 5 to 10, we'll say 10%, and they will take that 10% and automatically put it into a retirement account. And you don't have to pay taxes on that amount of money. All right. So the other 90% you get to keep after taxes to do what you want to with, but the 10% goes straight into a savings account without being taxed, meaning you have more money collecting more interest over a period of time as you're saving for retirement. The nice thing is that a lot of employers, not only will they take the amount of money that comes out of your paycheck into that account, but some of them will put their own money, contribute their own money into the account. So it's almost like getting a little bit of extra money into your savings account. And every employer is a little bit different with how much they will contribute. Now, there is something also called an individual retirement account, an IRA. And for the sake of argument, it's very similar to a 401k. You can put money into an IRA and not have to pay taxes on it. So what that means is you can put more money in it now, so it can collect more interest over time. So when you retire, it'll be a bigger pot of money for you. The difference is that it's not tied to employment. So if you are working for an employer who doesn't offer a 401k plan, you can still take your income and put it into an IRA account and have it tax sheltered. Now, once you start withdrawing from the account and you retire, you have to pay some taxes on it. But as you're investing it, you don't. And it's that, again, that helps you compound your principal. It helps your interest get bigger. Not your interest doesn't get bigger, but your principal, the amount of money you've invested, gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. One of the other issues about an IRA is the government does have rules about how much you can put into your IRA. Typically, you can contribute more to a 401k on average than an IRA, but And a lot of people will have both, a 401k and an IRA. So it, it is really important that you start saving up money for your accounts to retire on. And then finally, if you are fortunate enough to work for some sort of a large corporation or a lot of government jobs, like as a teacher, I fall into this category. School districts do this. They provide what is called a pension. And a pension's a little bit different. When you pay into a 401k or an IRA, you're actually paying into an account that you own and control. All right. And there are people that manage that account that for you in general, but that is your account. That is your pot of money. A pension is different. All right. Similar to a 401k, a pension is when I get my paycheck, a certain amount of my paycheck goes into my pension. My pension is called the State Teachers Retirement System. I'll just keep saying the word pension though. My money goes to that pension fund. And then that pension fund is used to pay retired teachers who are currently retired. And then when I retire, the teachers who are paying into the pension fund are paying for my retirement. All right, so I don't own my own account in a pension fund, but I am guaranteed, as long as I pay into the pension fund now, I am guaranteed into the future, as long as the law is provided at least, I am guaranteed into the future that when I retire, teachers will pay for my pension. And the big difference is, and the reason that some people think pensions are better than 401ks, the big difference is that once you reach retirement age in a pension, you are guaranteed a certain income for the rest of your retirement. And it is what we call a defined benefit. Whereas in a 401k or an IRA, the amount you get when you retire is solely based on how much money you have in the account. And because these accounts are oftentimes filled with stocks and bonds and a lot of stocks, if the stock market is down, you might not have a lot of money to retire on. So like right now, stocks are down. And people who are retiring right now on their 401ks are not making as much money in retirement as they could have had they retired last year when the stock market was up. Whereas when you have a pension, you pretty much know how much you're going to get paid once you retire. With a 401k or IRAs, it's really dependent upon the stock market. And again, remember, time and interest are on your side. You are young. Hopefully none of you have a lot of debt right now. If you do, pay off that first, but you can start saving for retirement now. And if you save a little bit every single year and get used to saving a certain percent of your income every year, whether it be in a 401k, an IRA, and there's a lot of other retirement tools. These are just the most basic. By the time you get to retirement age, you will have plenty to draw on as you retire. So today, if you haven't already, all you need to do to finish up the spreadsheet, all you need to do is enter in the estimates of how you would spend this 20% of your income right now. So again, if you made $50,000 a year, your monthly income of about $3,700, 20% of that is $750. So in the 50-30-20 plan, you should take $750 and save it or invest it. All right. Ideally, we'll talk about this next week. Ideally, you will not need to make additional payments on your credit card. That should be baked into the cake of your budget. But regardless, you want to make sure you're not carrying a huge balance month to month. All right. So how much of that 750 would you put into a basic savings account? If you do not have saved up half of your salary, most of it you'll want to go into a basic savings account. The rest of it, in theory, it's kind of up to you, but putting it away towards retirement is not a bad plan. The other thing is if you have 6 months salary, if you're putting a decent amount, about 10% of your income into retirement, and you have money left over, it's not bad to pay a little bit extra on your car payment, pay a little bit extra onto your house payment. Or if you want to, make additional investments, buy some stocks, buy some bonds, whatever, something of that nature. Right now, I know, unless some of you might be in a different situation financially than I was when I was your age, but right now, basic savings is where most of this money should go until you build up enough that you could live comfortably for 6 months if something dramatic happens. All right. So I look forward to kind of seeing what you put down here, seeing how well you can balance a 50-30-20 budget based on your estimated income. And if you have any questions, any problems at all, just let me know. Next week, we'll go into debt. Um, Hopefully not literally go into debt, but we'll learn about debt, good debt, bad debt. And then that's pretty much going to wrap up this unit. We'll do one final lesson to wrap up the year. I am going to ask that you tune in next week to our Google Meets. Just I want to see you one last time before the. That sounds very final. I'd like to see you again before the end of the break and before next fall. This I don't mean like one last time, like we'll never see each other again. That sounded rough. So I would like you to log into our Google Meets next week. I'd love to see you. All right. Have a great day, great weekend. Any questions? Shoot me an email. Let me know. Talk to you later. Bye.